My father says you need a wife." The words floated across the glittering ballroom with such calm certainty that every nearby conversation faded into an uneasy hush. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors. Champagne glasses paused halfway to smiling lips, and more than 200 executives quietly turned toward the man standing alone near the charity auction display. Ethan Walker didn't wear a tailored designer suit like the other guests. His navy sport coat had been pressed carefully at home. His brown leather shoes showed honest miles instead of luxury labels, and his attention had been fixed not on the billion-dollar donors around him, but on the framed watercolor painting his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, had donated for the Children's Hospital fundraiser. Across from him stood Charlotte Bennett, the youngest CEO ever to lead Bennett Holdings, a woman whose confidence could silence a boardroom with a single glance. Tonight, however, there was something uncertain behind her blue eyes. She hadn't planned to repeat her father's words out loud, but after watching Ethan quietly refuse every attempt to impress him throughout the evening, curiosity had finally overcome caution. Around them, whispers drifted like autumn leaves. Some expected the humble mechanic to blush. Others anticipated an awkward joke or an ambitious attempt to charm one of America's most admired business leaders. Instead, Ethan simply smiled. Not the smile of someone intimidated by wealth, nor the smile of a man chasing opportunity, but the quiet smile of someone completely at peace with who he had become. He looked toward Lily, who was laughing with volunteers near the dessert table, then returned his gaze to Charlotte. His voice remained gentle enough that people leaned closer just to hear it. "No, ma'am," he said. "My daughter doesn't need me to find her another mother. She deserves someone who chooses to love her before she ever chooses me." Silence arrived so completely that even the soft piano melody in the corner suddenly felt distant. Charlotte's lips parted, yet no answer came. For the first time in years, the woman famous for closing impossible negotiations found herself searching for words that refused to appear. Her father's expression softened with quiet satisfaction from across the room, as though he had been waiting for that single sentence all along. The applause that had filled the ballroom only moments before never returned. Instead, respect settled over the room like the first snowfall of winter, gentle, unexpected, and impossible to ignore. No one there realized they had just witnessed the beginning of a story that had started 5 days earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, inside a small repair garage where the scent of motor oil mixed with fresh coffee, where an aging pickup truck sat on a lift, where a little girl believed her father could fix almost anything except a broken heart, and where a man who had already lost the love of his life had no idea that destiny was quietly pulling a billionaire family toward the simple life he had spent years protecting with quiet dignity. 5 days earlier, the sunrise over Cedar Ridge painted the sky in soft shades of gold and pale blue, while the familiar hum of traffic slowly awakened the small Ohio town. Ethan Walker had already been at Walker Auto Repair for nearly an hour. The old brick garage smelled of fresh coffee, warm rubber, and engine oil, a scent that had become as comforting to him as the sound of his daughter's laughter. He tightened the final bolt beneath the hood of a weathered Ford F-150 before wiping his hands with a faded shop towel. Every movement was steady, practiced, and patient, as though years of rebuilding engines had quietly taught him how to rebuild pieces of himself. The radio played an old country song in the background, but it was nearly drowned out by a familiar voice bursting through the open garage door. "Daddy, do you think butterflies remember where they were born?" Lily asked, skipping inside with a bright yellow backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Ethan looked up and smiled without hesitation. "I think they remember wherever they felt safe." She considered his answer with the serious expression only children could manage before nodding proudly. "Then they would always come home." Ethan knelt beside her, gently brushing a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "That is exactly what I think too." He zipped her jacket, checked that her lunchbox was packed, and handed her the small paper bag containing the peanut butter cookies they had baked together the night before. There had been a time when mornings felt painfully quiet after his wife passed away, when every empty chair at the breakfast table reminded him of everything they had lost. Now those same mornings belonged to Lily, and every smile she offered became another reason to keep moving forward. Outside, his aging blue pickup truck waited in the driveway, its paint faded by countless summers, but its engine running faithfully because Ethan never neglected what others depended on. During the drive to school, Lily pointed excitedly at squirrels racing across telephone wires, dogs chasing tennis balls behind white fences, and an American flag fluttering outside the neighborhood fire station. Ethan listened to every story as though each one were the most important conversation in the world. At the elementary school entrance, Lily leaned across the center console and wrapped her small arms around his neck. "Have a good day fixing cars, Daddy." He laughed softly. "Have a good day fixing the world." She climbed out, waved twice, then disappeared through the front doors with the confidence that only comes from knowing someone will always be waiting when school ends. Ethan remained parked for another moment, watching until she was safely inside before pulling away. He never left early. He never checked his phone first. He never hurried past the little moments that mattered. Back at the garage, customers came and went throughout the morning. An elderly widow thanked him for charging less than expected. A young delivery driver apologized for being late on payment, and Ethan simply smiled and told him to take care of his family first. Another mechanic quietly asked why he always made life harder by refusing shortcuts that earned faster money. Ethan looked through the open garage door where sunlight spilled across the concrete floor and answered with calm certainty. "Because my daughter is watching everything I become, even when she is not standing here." The other mechanic had no reply. The room fell comfortably quiet except for the steady rhythm of tools against steel, while somewhere far beyond the little garage, a man named William Bennett had already begun searching for someone whose character could never be measured by a bank account. Across downtown Columbus, nearly 60 miles from Ethan's quiet garage, the top floor of Bennett Holdings overlooked a skyline built from ambition, glass, and steel. Morning sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting against polished conference tables where quarterly reports waited in perfectly organized stacks. Charlotte Bennett stood at the center of the executive boardroom wearing a tailored ivory suit, her posture confident and composed, her voice calm enough to command every person's attention without ever rising. At 34, she had become one of the youngest chief executive officers in the country, leading a company valued in the billions while earning the respect of investors who, twice her age, had once questioned whether she belonged in the boardroom at all. Now no one questioned her decisions. They simply waited for them. "Delay the expansion until the numbers justify it," she said, sliding a financial report across the table. "Growth without purpose becomes noise." Several executives exchanged surprised glances before quietly nodding in agreement. Charlotte had a reputation for seeing what others overlooked. She noticed hesitation before it became failure and opportunities before they became headlines. Yet beneath her remarkable success lived a silence she never discussed. Every evening, she returned to a penthouse overlooking the city, where the lights below shimmered beautifully but never greeted her by name. Dinner was usually prepared by someone else. The rooms remained perfectly arranged. Nothing was ever out of place except the feeling that something important had been missing for years. Her assistant entered quietly after the meeting ended. "Your father has arrived." Charlotte smiled almost instinctively. "Send him in." William Bennett walked into the office without ceremony, carrying no briefcase, no entourage, only a small paper bag from the neighborhood bakery they had visited together since Charlotte was a little girl. Time had added silver to his hair, but had never diminished the warmth in his eyes. "You skipped breakfast again," he said with a gentle smile. Charlotte accepted the bag and laughed softly. "You still know me too well." They shared fresh cinnamon rolls by the window while watching commuters hurry through the streets below. For several peaceful minutes, neither of them mentioned business. William preferred speaking about ordinary things. The changing leaves in the park, a family of robins nesting outside his porch, the little diner where the waitress always remembered his favorite coffee. Charlotte sometimes wondered whether her father had remained happier after stepping away from the company than he had ever been while building it. "You have another charity gala this weekend," William said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I almost canceled," Charlotte admitted. Another ballroom full of people trying to impress one another grows exhausting after a while. William nodded thoughtfully before looking out toward the horizon. "Money attracts attention, Charlotte. Character attracts peace. They are rarely found in the same room." She smiled politely, but did not answer. She had heard similar wisdom from him throughout her life, yet experience had taught her something different. Too many friendships had disappeared after business deals ended. Too many relationships had quietly dissolved once ambition entered the conversation. She had learned to trust contracts more easily than promises. William studied his daughter carefully. Recognizing the loneliness she worked so hard to hide beneath flawless professionalism. He did not criticize her guarded heart because he understood exactly how it had formed. Instead, he simply reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a small handwritten note with an address on it. "Before the gala," he said, placing the paper gently beside her coffee cup, "there is someone I would like you to meet. He does not know your name. He does not care about your company, and I believe that is exactly why meeting him may change more than you expect." Charlotte glanced at the address with quiet curiosity, unaware that it belonged to a modest repair garage where a father and daughter had already built the kind of life that money alone could never purchase. The address on William Bennett's handwritten note led him away from towering office buildings and carefully landscaped corporate campuses toward a quiet neighborhood where maple trees lined modest streets and children still rode bicycles until the streetlights came on. He left his luxury sedan a block away and continued on foot, choosing an ordinary jacket instead of the tailored suits that usually announced who he was before he ever spoke. Walker Auto Repair stood exactly where the note promised, its weathered brick walls carrying decades of honest work rather than polished perfection. The open garage door welcomed the crisp autumn air, and the steady rhythm of tools tapping against steel blended with the distant laughter of children from the elementary school playground nearby. William paused before stepping inside, watching unnoticed for a moment. Ethan Walker was kneeling beside an aging pickup truck while patiently explaining something to a teenage apprentice. "You never rush a repair because someone is waiting," Ethan said with an easy smile. "You fix it correctly because someone is depending on it." The young mechanic nodded thoughtfully before returning to work. There was no lecture in Ethan's voice, only quiet conviction earned through experience. Just then, the sound of a school bus stopping outside drifted through the garage. Ethan glanced toward the street almost instinctively. Seconds later, Lily came running through the open doorway with her backpack bouncing behind her. "Daddy, guess what happened today?" Ethan set down his wrench immediately, as though nothing else in the world deserved his attention more. "Tell me everything." Lily spoke excitedly about a science project, a spelling quiz, and how one classmate had forgotten lunch. "So I shared my sandwich because Miss Parker says kindness always comes back somehow." Ethan smiled with unmistakable pride. "I think Miss Parker is a very wise teacher." William remained quietly near the entrance, saying nothing while absorbing every small moment unfolding before him. There were no expensive toys scattered around, no luxurious office attached to the garage, no signs of extraordinary wealth. Yet there was something unexpectedly rich inside those ordinary conversations. A family built on presence instead of possessions. Ethan finally noticed the older gentleman waiting politely by the doorway and walked over with an easy smile. "Good afternoon. What can I do for you?" William extended his hand. "My name is William. I have an old Mustang that has been sitting in storage for years. Someone told me you are the only mechanic around here who still believes classic cars deserve patience." Ethan shook his hand warmly. "I believe people deserve patience too. Cars are just easier to understand." William chuckled, genuinely amused. "Would you be willing to take a look at it?" "Of course," Ethan replied. "Bring it by whenever you are ready." William hesitated before asking another question. Business must be good if you can afford to spend so much time talking instead of working. Ethan glanced toward Lily, who was now sitting at a small table coloring while waiting for him to finish the afternoon repairs. "Business pays the bills," he answered softly. "Those moments with my daughter are what make the bills worth paying." For a brief instant, William found himself unexpectedly emotional. He remembered saying almost those exact words to Charlotte when she was little, before endless meetings and expanding companies slowly stole more hours than he had intended to give away. He thanked Ethan for his time and turned toward the door, but before leaving he looked back once more. Lily had quietly walked over to an elderly customer struggling to carry a heavy grocery bag and offered to help him reach his car with the simple confidence of a child who had watched kindness practiced every day instead of merely discussed. William smiled to himself as he stepped into the afternoon sunshine. He had come searching for an honest mechanic. Instead, he believed he had just found the kind of man who reminded him that the greatest inheritance, parent could leave behind was never measured in dollars, but in the character a child carried into the world. The following afternoon arrived beneath a clear October sky, carrying the crisp scent of fallen leaves through the streets of Cedar Ridge. Just after lunch, a flatbed truck rolled slowly into Walker Auto Repair carrying a beautifully preserved 1967 Mustang convertible in deep forest green. Even before the engine had been unloaded, Ethan could see the careful craftsmanship beneath the dust collected during years of storage. He walked around the classic car with quiet admiration, running his fingertips lightly across the chrome trim without leaving a mark. "She has been loved," he said softly. William Bennett smiled. "She belonged to my late wife. I promised myself I would restore her one day, but time kept finding excuses for me." Ethan looked up with understanding that needed no explanation. Sometimes memories wait patiently until we are ready to touch them again. Together they carefully rolled the Mustang into the center bay. Sunlight streamed through the open garage door, catching tiny specks of dust that floated lazily through the warm afternoon air. Ethan lifted the hood and studied the engine with calm concentration. He never rushed to speak when silence still had something to teach him. William watched the mechanic's thoughtful expression before asking, "Can she be saved?" Ethan smiled gently. "I have learned not to use the word impossible around old machines. They surprise you when someone believes they still have value." Lily appeared from the small office carrying 2 paper cups of fresh coffee and a glass of apple juice. "Daddy says every guest gets something warm," she announced proudly while handing William the coffee with both hands. "Thank you, young lady," William replied. "You have wonderful manners." Lily grinned. "Daddy says kindness is free, so we should never run out of it." William laughed quietly, but his eyes lingered on Ethan. Those simple words sounded too natural to have been rehearsed. They had clearly been lived. Hours passed as Ethan patiently inspected hoses, fuel lines, wiring, and belts that had quietly aged through years of stillness. Every discovery became an opportunity to explain rather than complain. His young apprentice listened carefully while Ethan demonstrated each repair. "Anyone can replace a part," he said. "A good mechanic first asks why it failed. If you only fix the symptom, the problem eventually returns." William recognized that Ethan was speaking about far more than automobiles. As the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the garage floor, William reached into his wallet and removed several large bills. "Please accept this as a deposit," he said. Ethan glanced at the money before gently pushing it back across the workbench. "Not yet. I have not earned it." William looked surprised. "You have already spent hours on the inspection." Ethan shook his head. "I inspected her because that is what she needed. I will accept payment when I return something worthy of your memories." For several long seconds neither man spoke. Outside, a cool breeze stirred the American flag hanging above the garage entrance while distant church bells echoed softly across town. Finally William folded the money and placed it back into his wallet. "Not many people refuse easy money anymore," he admitted. Ethan closed the hood carefully and rested one hand on the old Mustang. "Easy money disappears quickly. Peace of mind stays with you much longer." William nodded almost imperceptibly. In that quiet moment, surrounded by worn tools, old wood cabinets, and the steady scent of motor oil, he understood something that years inside executive boardrooms had never fully taught him. Integrity did not announce itself with impressive speeches. It revealed itself through ordinary choices made when no reward was guaranteed. As William prepared to leave, he looked back at Ethan laughing with Lily over a small smudge of grease on her nose, and a single thought settled firmly into his heart. If his daughter ever found happiness, it would never come from another powerful executive. It would come from a man whose greatest success was already standing beside him, calling him Dad with complete trust. That evening the lights inside the Bennett family estate glowed softly against the darkening autumn sky, casting warm reflections across the quiet lake behind the house. Unlike the towering headquarters that carried the family name, this place had always been a home before it was ever a symbol of success. Charlotte arrived just after sunset, setting her tablet on the dining room table before loosening the tension in her shoulders with a slow breath. The scent of roasted chicken and fresh rosemary drifted from the kitchen, a recipe her late mother had prepared every Sunday long before business dinners replaced family meals. William poured 2 glasses of iced tea and waited until they were seated before speaking. I visited the mechanic again today, he said casually. Charlotte smiled without looking up from her plate. The one with the Mustang? The very one. She nodded politely. I hope he knows what he is doing. William folded his hands together. He knows exactly what he is doing, whether he is repairing a car or raising a child. Charlotte looked up with mild curiosity. You sound unusually impressed. William smiled. Because I am. A comfortable silence settled over the dining room as silverware rested quietly against porcelain plates. Outside, crickets filled the cool evening air while gentle winds stirred the oak trees surrounding the property. Finally, William leaned back in his chair and studied his daughter with the same thoughtful expression he had worn throughout her childhood, whenever he hoped she would truly listen instead of simply hearing. Charlotte, he began gently, if life ever gives you another chance to build a family, I hope you choose someone like Ethan Walker. She blinked in surprise. A mechanic? William did not flinch. A father. Charlotte gave a quiet laugh, believing he must be teasing her. Dad, you cannot be serious. I have rarely been more serious. She set down her fork. You spent 2 afternoons watching one man repair an old car, and now you think he belongs in our family? William answered calmly. No. I watched him stop working every time his daughter needed him. I watched him refuse money he had not earned. I watched him teach a young apprentice with patience instead of pride. I watched him treat strangers with the same respect he offered friends. Those things are far more difficult than repairing engines. Charlotte leaned back, crossing her arms. The world does not work that way anymore. Character alone does not build companies. William nodded. Perhaps not. But companies are not what people hold on to when they are sitting beside a hospital bed or celebrating a child's graduation. Charlotte looked toward the large family portrait hanging above the fireplace, her expression softening only slightly. You know I have responsibilities. I know, William replied quietly. I also know responsibilities can quietly become walls if we are not careful. She stood and walked toward the window overlooking the lake. Reflections shimmered across the still water beneath the moonlight, beautiful yet strangely distant. You really believe this man is different? William rose slowly and joined her. I do not believe he is perfect. I believe he remembers what matters before the world reminds him to forget. Charlotte remained silent for several moments, watching leaves drift across the surface of the lake. Then she turned with a faint smile that carried equal parts disbelief and determination. Very well, she said. I will meet your remarkable mechanic. But I suspect you have allowed sentiment to cloud your judgment. William smiled knowingly, the quiet confidence in his eyes unchanged. That is possible, he admitted. Or perhaps success has clouded yours. Charlotte had no immediate answer. For the first time in years, someone had challenged her certainty without questioning her intelligence. And somewhere deep inside her carefully ordered world, curiosity quietly began replacing confidence. The next morning arrived wrapped in cool autumn sunshine, and Walker Auto Repair was already alive with the familiar sounds of impact wrenches, humming engines, and the occasional laughter drifting from the office where Lily finished her homework before school. Ethan had just lowered the restored Mustang from the lift when a sleek black luxury sedan rolled quietly into the parking lot. It looked strangely out of place among pickup trucks dusted with gravel and family sedans. Waiting for repairs, Charlotte Bennett stepped out wearing a simple camel-colored coat over casual clothes instead of her usual executive attire. She had deliberately left the company car, security staff, and designer image behind, determined to see the man her father admired without revealing who she truly was. Ethan looked up from wiping his hands and offered the same warm smile he gave every customer. Good morning. How can I help you? Charlotte returned the smile politely. I was told you might be able to look at my car. It has been making a strange sound for a few days. Ethan nodded without asking who she was or what she did for a living. Let us take a look. He listened carefully as the engine idled before leaning closer for several quiet moments. There was no dramatic inspection, no unnecessary explanation meant to impress. Finally, he stepped back. The serpentine belt is beginning to wear. It is not urgent today, but I would replace it before winter. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. That is all. Ethan smiled. Sometimes the smallest parts prevent the biggest problems. She watched him closely, almost waiting for him to suggest expensive repairs that were not needed, but he simply handed her the estimate. The amount was surprisingly modest. You could probably charge much more, she observed. Ethan shrugged gently. I charge what the work is worth, not what the customer can afford. Before Charlotte could answer, Lily burst through the office carrying a drawing covered with bright crayons. Daddy, I finished the picture for the children's hospital. Ethan turned immediately, his face lighting up with genuine joy. Can I see? Lily proudly held up the drawing of a family standing beneath a rainbow beside a small garage with an American flag waving above it. Charlotte noticed there were only 2 people holding hands in the picture. It is beautiful, Ethan said softly. Who are they? Lily smiled. That is us. She hesitated before adding quietly. I left Mommy in heaven because that is where she lives now. Ethan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She would be very proud of you. Charlotte looked away for a moment, unexpectedly moved by the simple honesty between father and daughter. There was no sadness hiding behind their words, only quiet love that had learned how to keep living. As Lily skipped back inside, Charlotte reached into her purse and removed a business card. Actually, she said, choosing her words carefully, I work with a company that occasionally hires consultants with practical experience. Someone like you could earn several times what you make here. Ethan glanced at the card without reading the company name. That is generous. Would you consider it? She asked. He smiled with sincere gratitude before handing the card back untouched. I appreciate the opportunity, but I promised Lily I would always be here when school lets out. A larger paycheck cannot replace afternoons that disappear forever. Charlotte blinked, surprised by how quickly he answered. You would refuse a better career because of a schedule? Ethan looked toward the school bus, turning onto the nearby street, as though the answer were obvious. Children only grow up once. Careers usually wait. I know which one deserves my time. The breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the open garage as silence settled gently between them. Charlotte had arrived expecting to test an ordinary mechanic. Instead, every question she asked seemed to reveal another quiet strength that money, influence, and ambition had somehow never managed to teach her. Charlotte expected the conversation to end after Ethan declined her offer, yet something kept her from walking back to her car. Instead, she accepted his invitation to stay while the replacement belt was installed, choosing a worn wooden chair near the office window where afternoon sunlight stretched across the concrete floor in long golden lines. The garage carried none of the polished elegance she was accustomed to, but it possessed something strangely comforting. The smell of fresh coffee blended with motor oil. Classic rock played softly from an old radio balanced on a dusty shelf, and every customer who stepped through the door seemed to leave smiling whether they had spent $50 or $500. Ethan greeted each person by name whenever he could, asking about their families before discussing their vehicles. It was a small habit, almost invisible, yet Charlotte noticed that people remembered how he made them feel long after the repairs were finished. Just before 3 o'clock, the familiar yellow school bus stopped outside. Ethan quietly set down his wrench before the engine cover was completely secured. His apprentice glanced toward the unfinished work. I can finish tightening those bolts, the young man offered. Ethan smiled appreciatively. Thank you. Lily comes first. Charlotte watched through the open garage door as Lily skipped across the parking lot carrying a paper grocery bag instead of her backpack. The little girl ran directly to her father, wrapped him in a quick hug, and proudly lifted the bag into the air. Guess what Miss Parker gave our class today? Ethan looked inside. Fresh apples, bread, peanut butter. Looks like someone is planning dinner. Lily grinned. Actually, Mrs. Henderson forgot to buy groceries because her husband is still in the hospital, so I asked if we could share ours. Ethan knelt until they were eye level. That sounds like a wonderful idea. Are you sure you want to give away your favorite apples? Lily nodded without hesitation. Miss Parker says kindness grows when people keep passing it around. Ethan laughed softly. She keeps giving you excellent homework. Charlotte found herself smiling before she realized it. She had attended charity galas where million-dollar checks were presented beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet somehow this little paper bag filled with ordinary groceries felt more meaningful than many of those polished speeches. A few minutes later, Ethan closed the garage 15 minutes earlier than usual. His apprentice looked surprised. We still have 2 cars waiting. Ethan handed him the keys to the finished sedan. Those customers know I always deliver tomorrow morning if it gets late. Mrs. Henderson cannot wait until tomorrow for dinner. Without another word, Ethan placed the grocery bag in his pickup truck while Lily climbed into the passenger seat. Charlotte stepped outside just as they prepared to leave. "You are closing early for that?" she asked. Quietly. Ethan nodded. Some things should never be scheduled after business hours. Before she could respond, Lily leaned out the open window. "Would you like to come with us? Mrs. Henderson makes the best oatmeal cookies when she feels better." Charlotte almost laughed at the invitation. No executive had ever invited her anywhere with such innocent sincerity. "Thank you," she answered gently. "Maybe another time." Lily waved enthusiastically as the old pickup disappeared down the tree-lined street. Charlotte remained standing beside her luxury sedan long after they had gone, listening to the wind rustle through the autumn leaves. She suddenly realized she could not remember the last time anyone had invited her somewhere without expecting something in return. For the first time in many years, the woman who had spent her life mastering billion-dollar negotiations found herself quietly wondering whether the richest person she had met all week was the mechanic driving away in a 20-year-old pickup truck. Saturday evening arrived wrapped in the gentle glow of hundreds of string lights suspended above the grand ballroom of the Children's Hope Foundation. Fresh white roses decorated every table. A jazz trio filled the room with soft melodies, and guests dressed in elegant evening attire exchanged warm greetings beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected countless points of golden light. Ethan entered quietly with Lily beside him, both wearing their very best. His navy jacket had been carefully pressed the night before, while Lily wore a pale blue dress she had proudly chosen because, as she often said, it reminded her of the summer sky. Neither of them noticed the curious glances that followed them through the room. William Bennett spotted them first. A genuine smile crossed his face as he walked over to greet them. "I am so glad you came," he said warmly, shaking Ethan's hand before kneeling to Lily's height. "And I have been looking forward to seeing the artist who painted our favorite picture." Lily smiled shyly. "Daddy helped me frame it." "Then you both deserve the credit," William replied. Across the ballroom, Charlotte watched the exchange while speaking. With several board members, she had spent the last 2 days trying to convince herself that her father's admiration for Ethan had been exaggerated by nostalgia. Yet every time she observed the mechanic, she found another quiet reason to question her own assumptions. Ethan never tried to meet influential people. He never searched for important conversations. Instead, he carried Lily's small plate from the buffet, thanked every volunteer who offered assistance, and patiently listened while elderly donors shared stories about classic automobiles and family road trips. People naturally gathered around him without understanding why. There was no performance in his kindness. It simply existed. Later that evening, after the charity auction concluded and applause slowly faded into comfortable conversation, William gently approached Charlotte. His expression carried the quiet confidence she had learned to recognize since childhood. "Now is the time," he said softly. Charlotte looked toward Ethan, who was helping Lily straighten the ribbon on her donated painting before it was delivered to the winning bidder. She took a slow breath, smoothed the front of her emerald evening gown, and walked across the ballroom. Conversations gradually softened as several guests recognized the famous chief executive officer approaching the modest mechanic. Ethan looked up with the same calm smile he had offered her at the garage. "Good evening," he said. "It is nice to see you again." Charlotte returned the greeting before glancing briefly toward her father, who gave only the slightest encouraging nod. She hesitated for the first time in years. Board meetings had never unsettled her. Television interviews had never intimidated her. Yet speaking one simple sentence suddenly felt strangely difficult. Finally, she gathered her courage. "There is something my father wanted me to tell you," she said quietly. Ethan waited patiently without interrupting. Around them, nearby conversations faded into silence as curious guests sensed something unusual unfolding. Charlotte met his eyes and repeated the words exactly as William had spoken them the night before. "My father said you needed a wife." The sentence floated gently through the still ballroom. Several people smiled awkwardly. Others exchanged puzzled glances, expecting surprise, embarrassment, or perhaps laughter. William remained completely still. Lily looked curiously from Charlotte to her father without saying a word. Ethan lowered his gaze for a brief moment before looking back at Charlotte with the same quiet peace that had guided every choice she had witnessed since the day they met. His answer came without hesitation. spoken so gently that everyone leaned closer to hear every word. The silence lingered for several heartbeats before Ethan finally smiled, not with discomfort, but with the quiet grace that had become part of everything he did. He looked briefly toward Lily, who stood beside him holding his hand with complete trust, then returned his eyes to Charlotte. His voice remained calm, warm, and steady enough that every word seemed to settle gently across the ballroom. "No, ma'am," he said. "I do not need a wife." A few guests exchanged uncertain glances, expecting the conversation to end there, but Ethan continued before anyone could interrupt. "My daughter does not need someone to replace her mother. She deserves someone who chooses to love her long before she ever chooses me." The room became so still that the soft notes of the piano from across the ballroom suddenly sounded miles away. Charlotte opened her mouth to answer, yet no words arrived. She had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, stood before thousands of shareholders, and defended impossible decisions under relentless pressure, but no prepared response existed for the quiet truth she had just heard. Ethan looked down at Lily with unmistakable affection. "When my wife passed away," he continued softly, "I made one promise. I promised our little girl that I would never invite someone into our lives simply because I was lonely. If another person ever becomes part of our family, it must be because she already loves this little girl without asking for anything in return. That is not something money can buy, and it is not something time should ever rush." Lily squeezed his hand and leaned gently against his arm. There was no sadness on her face, only peaceful certainty that her father meant every word. Several guests quietly lowered their eyes. An elderly couple seated near the stage reached for each other's hands. Even the waitstaff paused respectfully before continuing their work. Charlotte felt something unfamiliar pressing against the carefully guarded walls around her heart. Throughout her career, she had met countless people eager to impress her, flatter her, or gain access to her influence. Ethan had done none of those things. Instead, he had spoken only about protecting the happiness of an 8-year-old girl. William Bennett watched the moment unfold with quiet satisfaction. His daughter had spent years believing strength meant never allowing herself to become vulnerable. Yet one humble mechanic had revealed a different kind of strength altogether. Charlotte finally found her voice, though it came much softer than anyone expected. "You never considered that you deserve happiness too?" Ethan smiled gently. "Happiness has been eating pancakes across from me every Saturday morning for the last 8 years." A ripple of warm laughter passed through the ballroom, not because the answer was clever, but because it was unmistakably sincere. Ethan continued, "If I am ever blessed with love again, it will simply become another gift for both of us. It will never become the condition for our happiness." Charlotte lowered her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by emotions she had not anticipated. She suddenly remembered all the evenings she had spent alone inside a penthouse overlooking the city, believing success required constant sacrifice. Standing before her was a man who possessed almost none of her wealth, yet seemed richer in every way that truly mattered. She slowly looked back into Ethan's eyes, but this time she no longer saw an ordinary mechanic. She saw a father whose quiet dignity had accomplished something no title, fortune, or boardroom victory ever had. Without raising his voice, without seeking admiration, and without asking for anything in return, he had left an entire room speechless. No one spoke for several long moments. The ballroom remained wrapped in a silence that felt less like awkwardness and more like respect finally finding its proper place. William Bennett slowly stepped forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound across the marble floor. He rested one gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder before turning toward the gathered guests, and, finally, toward his daughter. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "there is something I never told you." She looked at him with surprise. Throughout her life, her father had rarely kept secrets from her. William smiled faintly before continuing. 3 years ago, after your mother passed away, I drove her Mustang out of storage for the first time. About 20 miles outside town, the engine failed. Ethan listened politely, not realizing where the story was leading. I had left my phone at home, and the nearest service station was closed. I remember standing beside that old car wondering how someone who had built so much could suddenly feel completely helpless. William's voice softened as memories returned. Then an old blue pickup stopped behind me. A young father climbed out carrying a toolbox. Several guests slowly turned toward Ethan. William continued. He never asked my name. He never recognized the car. He simply smiled and asked if I needed help. Ethan's expression changed slightly as the memory surfaced. The fuel line had come loose, he said quietly. William nodded. It took you less than 15 minutes to fix it. Charlotte looked from her father to Ethan, her eyes widening. William reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed an old folded receipt. Time had softened the paper, but the handwriting remained clear. When I asked how much I owed you, you refused every dollar. Ethan smiled faintly. It was a small repair. William shook his head gently. No, it was much larger than that. He unfolded the receipt and held it where Charlotte could see the sentence Ethan had written years earlier after refusing payment. The note simply read, "Take your wife somewhere beautiful while the car is still running well. That will always be worth more than my labor today." Charlotte covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Mother was still alive then, William whispered. She had already become very ill, although few people knew. That afternoon became our final drive through the countryside together. We stopped beside the river, shared pie from a little diner, and watched the sunset without speaking much at all. 2 weeks later, she was gone. Tears quietly filled his eyes, but his voice never lost its warmth. You gave us our last peaceful day together, Ethan. Not because you knew who we were. Not because you expected gratitude. You simply believed kindness should never carry a price tag. Ethan lowered his eyes with quiet humility. I only fixed a car. William smiled through the emotion. No, my friend. You repaired a memory that my family will carry forever. Around the ballroom, more than one guest discreetly brushed away tears. Even those who had spent their lives measuring success through titles and accomplishments understood that they had just witnessed something far greater than generosity. Charlotte looked at Ethan differently now, not through the eyes of a chief executive officer evaluating character, but through the eyes of a daughter realizing that the man standing before her had unknowingly given her parents one final beautiful chapter together. In that quiet moment, every impressive achievement hanging on the walls of Bennett Holdings seemed to fade beside one simple act of kindness performed by a father who had never asked for recognition and never imagined that goodness, offered without expectation, could echo across another family's life for years. The days that followed the gala unfolded with a quiet rhythm that neither Charlotte nor Ethan had expected. There were no dramatic declarations, no headlines, and no grand gestures. Instead, there were ordinary afternoons that slowly reshaped extraordinary lives. Charlotte found herself visiting Walker Auto Repair more often, always finding a practical excuse that grew less convincing with every visit. Sometimes she asked Ethan to inspect the sedan. Other times, she simply brought fresh coffee from a small bakery she had discovered near the garage. Ethan never treated her differently after learning who she really was. He greeted her with the same warm smile, accepted her kindness with quiet gratitude, and returned to tightening bolts or helping customers without changing who he had always been. At first, Charlotte found that almost frustrating. Then she realized it was exactly why she kept coming back. One crisp Saturday morning, she accepted Lily's invitation to help bake apple pies for the church fundraiser. The little kitchen inside Ethan's modest home filled with the scent of cinnamon, butter, and warm apples while sunlight streamed through lace curtains that had been hanging there since Ethan's wife was alive. Charlotte rolled dough for the first time in years, laughing quietly after covering her sleeve with flour. Lily giggled so hard that Ethan had to pretend to appoint both of them as official kitchen apprentices. I think we need more practice, Charlotte admitted while looking at the slightly uneven pie crust. Ethan smiled. Perfect pies disappear in one afternoon. Imperfect memories last forever. Later they carried the finished pies to the church hall, where neighbors greeted Ethan by name and welcomed Charlotte without recognizing one of the most influential business leaders in the state. No one asked about stock prices or corporate acquisitions. They simply thanked her for helping arrange folding chairs, serving lemonade, and cleaning tables after lunch. For the first time in many years, Charlotte experienced the quiet satisfaction of being appreciated for her presence instead of her position. As the afternoon faded into evening, she and Lily sat together on the old wooden swing outside Ethan's porch, watching fireflies appear above the grass. Can I tell you a secret? Lily asked softly. Charlotte smiled. Of course. The little girl looked toward the sunset before answering. I used to think grown-ups stopped missing people when they smiled again. Charlotte listened without speaking. Lily continued, Daddy told me missing someone and loving new people can happen at the same time. Hearts get bigger. They do not replace people. Charlotte felt her eyes fill with tears she had not expected. Years of success had taught her how to manage companies, negotiate impossible contracts, and solve complex problems, yet an 8-year-old child had just explained healing more clearly than any leadership seminar ever could. That evening, as they walked back toward the house, Ethan quietly thanked Charlotte for spending the day with them. You did not have to give up your weekend. She looked around at the modest porch, the laughter still echoing inside the house, and the little girl skipping ahead while humming to herself. Then she answered with complete honesty, I did not give anything up today. I think I finally found something I have been missing for a very long time. Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply smiled with the same quiet dignity that had first captured William Bennett's attention. And somewhere deep inside Charlotte's heart, the walls built by years of ambition, disappointment, and careful distance began giving way to something much stronger than success. They began making room for home. 1 year later, the first Saturday of October arrived beneath a cloudless blue sky, and the little white chapel overlooking Cedar Ridge looked as though it had been waiting for this day all along. Wildflowers lined the stone walkway instead of expensive decorations. Folding wooden chairs replaced grand banquet tables, and every smiling face belonged to someone whose life had somehow been touched by kindness. The restored 1967 Mustang sat quietly beneath an old maple tree, polished until it reflected the golden afternoon sunlight. William Bennett rested one hand against its hood before looking toward the chapel with peaceful eyes. He had attended corporate celebrations worth millions of dollars, but none had ever felt as meaningful as this simple gathering. Inside, soft piano music drifted through the open windows while Ethan waited near the front, wearing the same calm smile that had never depended on circumstance. He was not standing there because he had searched for wealth or status. He was standing there because time had quietly proven what patience already knew. Charlotte appeared at the chapel entrance wearing an elegant ivory dress that carried more grace than extravagance. She had stepped away from the relentless pace of daily corporate leadership months earlier, choosing to build a life that left room for dinners, school plays, weekend breakfasts, and conversations that could never fit onto a calendar. As she began walking down the aisle, she did not look like a celebrated chief executive officer. She looked like a woman who had finally found the courage to stop measuring her life by accomplishments and start measuring it by love. Halfway to the front, she paused unexpectedly. Lily stood beside William holding a small bouquet of white daisies almost as large as her smile. William gently squeezed the little girl's shoulder before whispering, I believe someone has been waiting for you. Lily walked toward Charlotte, her small shoes tapping softly against the wooden floor. She looked up with hopeful blue eyes before speaking the words she had quietly carried inside her heart for months. Would it be all right if I held your hand for the rest of the way? Charlotte's eyes filled instantly with grateful tears. She knelt until they were face to face and nodded without speaking. Lily slipped her tiny hand into Charlotte's, and together they finished the walk toward Ethan. When they reached him, there were no dramatic speeches. Ethan simply looked at both of them with the same quiet gratitude that had guided him through every season of his life. The ceremony itself was simple, sincere, and filled with gentle laughter. Friends shared stories, neighbors offered blessings, and sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, painting soft colors across the wooden pews. As the minister declared them husband and wife, applause rose warmly throughout the chapel. Yet the most unforgettable moment came afterward. Charlotte knelt beside Lily while everyone gathered outside beneath the maple trees. She brushed a loose curl away from the little girl's face and smiled through happy tears. Lily studied her for one thoughtful second before wrapping both arms around her. In a voice so soft that many guests barely heard it, she whispered, Welcome home, Mom. Silence settled across the garden once more, the same kind of silence that had begun this remarkable journey, not empty, but filled with understanding. William quietly looked toward the sky and smiled, believing his late wife would have loved every beautiful, ordinary moment. The old Mustang waited patiently nearby, its engine restored, its memories honored, its journey continuing with a new family inside. And perhaps that is how the greatest miracles always arrive. Not with noise, applause, or impossible fortune, but with quiet dignity, faithful hearts, second chances, and the simple courage to love someone before asking what they can offer in return.